Now, I know this video is about reforms in the Industrial Revolution, but to do that, we need to go back in time. Industrialization. Industrialization. What is industrialization? Are factories industrialization? Are birds industrialization? Is this industrialization? But more importantly, why is industrialization? Why am I in a white void? Why isn't there a hole in this wall? If you or a loved one have suffered from industrialization from these products, you may be entitled to financial compensation. If your industrialization lasts more than 4 hours, you need to see a medical professional. If you don't have any bowel movements in the next 3 days, then you may have industrialization. Okay, maybe not that far back. Britain, 18th century. Indian cotton is the new fad, and Britain wants to take advantage of this, so they start importing loads, and I mean tons, of Indian cotton. It got to the point that Mughal Indian cotton made up almost 95% of British imports from Asia. Fortunately for them, they forgot they needed time to turn the raw cotton into textiles. Fortunately for them, some British inventors were able to come up with solutions. In 1733, John Kay improved a device called a shuttle that passed horizontal and vertical threads through each other, so the shuttle would rapidly go across the loom. He called it the flying shuttle. This, however, caused a shortage of cotton thread, which sparked James Hargreaves to make the spinning jenny, another hand-driven invention that could spin multiple threads at the same time. Around the same time, Richard Arkwright invented the spinning frame, which, unlike the others, was powered by water. Because of this, it was also called the water frame, and was considered to be the first true factory. Hand power turned into water power, which turned into steam power in 1712 by the first practical steam engine invented by Thomas Newcomen and improved by James Watt in the 1760s. Britain's cotton production increased 10 times from 1770 to 1790, and other countries were starting to notice, and Britain noticed them noticing them, so they made laws prohibiting the sharing of industrial technology to other countries. But unfortunately for Britain, the other countries had noticed that Britain noticed that they were noticing them, and came up with a plan that went something like this. Wow, look at all this steam and water-powered technology we have over here. It might usher in a new age. I'll call it the Technological Revolution. I mean, you're not technically wrong, but everyone just knows it as
the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, but industrialization hasn't started in America, so no one really cares. Who are you anyway? Oh, I'm a new worker. Where from? Just down the road. Oh, and can I borrow your blueprint schematics, your last 4 digits social security number, and some machine parts? Yeah, sure. Hey, wait, where are you going? Oh, and this. This probably won't have any negative consequences in the future. There are immediate negative consequences in the future. America. Finally. The Industrial Revolution has begun, mostly due to the appropriating of British inventions. However, later in the Revolution, America makes innovations like the cotton gin, products made of replaceable parts in the assembly line, which helped them lead the industrial period. The rapid growth of businesses and factories that lead to a small oversight in ethics. Maybe that wasn't the best idea. And it was not, at least for the working class. Businesses grew exponentially, with entrepreneurs like Rockefeller and Carnegie creating some of America's first monopolies. But this was at the expense of the working class Americans, who had to work long hours, had little to no breaks, and almost no safety precautions. Due to this disparity in prosperity between the business and the working class, this era was also known as the Gilded Age. Businesses were mostly unchecked with how they treated their workers because of things like the 40-hour workweek, child labor laws, and general safety precautions were not put into place yet. So how exactly did these reforms come to be? By this point, workers and the general public were unhappy with the treatment of workers during the Gilded Age. Pay was so low that oftentimes entire families, including their children, had to work to support each other, and living conditions in tenement housings were horrific. The main goal for people of this time were to get better living conditions, get better pay, and to regulate big businesses. Many groups often went on strikes, protests, and took to the courts to put into place a series of reforms called the Progressive Era. Labor unions were a key part in the Progressive Era, although they started much earlier, with skilled workers instead. The unions believed that there were two main classes, the rich business owners and the poor working class. They were mostly right. With no minimum wage and nothing to stop business from cutting pay, many businesses kept their workers poor and reliant on them. It even got to the point where some factories were paying their workers in currency that they could only spend on company grounds. Some of the first prominent labor unions were the National Labor Union and the Knights of Labor. These early groups refused to do normal protest things like boycotting and picketing, instead tried to look at workers' higher hopes instead of their immediate interests. This, however, quickly changed in the 1880s when a lot of fed-up workers joined the Knights of Labor and started carrying out strikes. National trade unions tried to get them to stop, but ultimately failed, and disgruntled workers joined to become the American Federation of Labor, or AFL. Some leaders of the unions were socialist or Marxist, like Samuel Gompers, who thought that the unions would inevitably become tools for revolution. The AFL was asserted as a union for all workers regardless of skill, occupation, or race. However, some parts of the union failed to organize workers, most notably in the meatpacking industry among the lower-skilled laborers, causing a lack of reforms in that area. Muckrakers were another very big part of the Progressive period. They were journalists, authors, or anyone else who exposed conditions of the working-class Americans during the Gilded Age. Probably seen one of these pictures. These are all pictures that muckrakers took of living conditions in tenement housings and factories during the Industrial Age. There are many muckrakers, like Jacob Reeves, who's responsible for this picture, Ida B. Wells, and Upton Sinclair. Speaking of Upton Sinclair, he's a little different from the others. Most of the other muckrakers just wrote reports and took pictures about what was going on, but Sinclair wrote fiction books mostly, so he wrote a story about his experiences in the meatpacking industry in his famous book, The Jungle. Upton Sinclair was an outspoken socialist, and he tried to strengthen socialism in America by producing The Jungle, but people were more interested in the depiction of various health code violations and general disregard for workers' well-being. Because many reforms, like the Pure Food and Drug Act, which made it so companies had to label their food products, and the Meat Inspection Act, which made it so bad or mislabeled meat cannot be used in products. Muckrakers showed that American people who were not already experiencing these conditions, what living in working conditions were like for the poor working class. Jacob Reeves was a famous journalist whose 18-page photo essay called How the Other Half Lived, Studies Among the Tenants of New York, led to the creation of the Tenement Housing Act of 1901, which made conditions better in tenement housing. Ida B. Wells, another author, was born as a slave in 1862, joined the anti-lynching activist groups in the 1890s. In 1892, Wells published another famous book, Southern Horrors, Lynch Laws in All of Its Phases, which talked about the treatment of blacks and, to the extent, poor whites. She was also one of the original founders of the NAACP, which we will talk about later. And by later, I mean now. Defining everything the various civil rights groups did, and even talking about all the groups themselves, would take a very long time. Even the message of the main groups varied a lot, so I'm just going to give you the spark notes of some of the main and most influential ones. Some civil rights groups sought change by protesting and boycotting, like the National Association of Colored Women. Some tried to do it economically, like the National Negro Business League. Some did it by taking on injustices in the courts, like the NAACP, and some used just a teensy bit of militarism, like the Niagara Movement and the Black Panther Party. Three most prominent leaders of different civil rights movements were Booker T. Washington, Ida B. Wells, and W.E.B. Du Bois because of either their prominence in many groups or their clashing ideologies. Booker T. Washington thought that blacks should use education to end social issues, so he created a school called the Tuskegee Institute. W.E.B. Du Bois was ideologically opposed to Washington's viewpoint and willing to directly fight for racial equality using more direct and militant strategies. Ida B. Wells, the muckraker we talked about in the last section, wrote articles that contributed to the civil rights era and most notably to an anti-lynching campaign. For the groups, we'll just talk about the most prominent group, the NAACP, or unabbreviated, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, because it would take way too long to talk about all the others, and we need to get to the thesis. The NAACP was founded in 1909 by both W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, along with Mary White Ovington, but she is not on the list of the MV people in the civil rights movement spanning from 1897 through 1920. If you're wondering, neither is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., because he didn't come into the picture until the mid-1950s. So yeah, I have a dream speech is not a thing here. Bummer. The NAACP's main goal is to fight social inequality, mainly by forming lawsuits like Murray v. Maryland in 1936, which forced the University of Maryland's law school to desegregate. Gaines v. Canada, which ordered the admission of black students into the University of Missouri in 1938, and the most famous case, Brown v. the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which I like calling by its full name because it is fun. Brown v. the Board of Education was a very important case because it overturned the ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson case, which decided that public facilities can be separate but should still be equal. The equal part of the ruling was completely ignored by the majority of southern states, so
for thousands of years, the NAACP lay dormant, gathering evidence to unleash into one super mondo deluxe case,
which happened to be Brown v. the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. The case concluded with the ruling that separate facilities could not be equal, which made segregation officially not allowed. This did not stop southern states from segregating until the Civil Rights Act and their amendments, but those legislations happened after the Progressive Era, so I'm not going to talk about them, even though I technically already did by saying that. You know that thesis at the beginning of the video? Yeah, that one. Let's talk about that. You know that long intro that was just a huge info dump? That was all to show how fast all of these changes happened. The Second Industrial Revolution lasted from 1870 to 1914. This means that all the changes from stealing British technology to modern factories took only 44 years. This is a stupidly short time for such a large amount of change to happen, so there were a lot of kinks to work out. Reforms did not take long to happen because of immense suffering of the working class people, but would the reforms have taken place without the reform groups? The obvious answer would be yes, because the other groups would just take their place. But what would happen if, hypothetically, no groups tried to impose changes in working living conditions? Even though the situation would most likely be impossible, I still think the reforms would have taken place, regardless of incentive from the people. This goes back to the foundation of the argument between capitalism and communism. Capitalism tries to stimulate economic process by giving people the option to become entrepreneurs and create their own industries. They do this by competing with other people trying to do the same thing. Communism tries to achieve economic prosperity and stability through regulation and force. One of the reasons why communism doesn't work is that people have no incentive to work harder or innovate because they will always have the same wages and benefits no matter what they do or where they work. Capitalist societies try to circumvent this by encouraging innovation and good work with monetary gain. An example of this is when Henry Ford doubled his workers' salaries to $5 a day and cut the work hours in his factory to 8 hours a day. When you look at that, you would think that doubling your workers' pay and cutting their hours would make you lose a substantial amount of money, but that was not the case. I know you're all thinking about it, so I just want to address it now. He did not do this just because he felt generous after improving the assembly line. Corporate historian for the Ford Motor Company, Bob Krapek, believes that Henry Ford was a hard-nosed businessman. He didn't introduce the $5 workday because he was a nice guy. It was mainly to stabilize the workforce, and it sure did. The increase of wages stabilized the workforce by attracting a large bunch of workers that would be more reliable than ever. This move ended up working in much greater effect than even Ford thought was possible. The productivity of the Ford Motor Company improved so much and so quickly that profits more than doubled in just 2 years. Giving his workers more money also meant that they could go out and buy more goods, including Ford's Model T, which increased commerce. The difference between governments being communist or capitalist is not as simple as evil and good. The only difference is their philosophy on how to best make people work and innovate to propel their societies forward. At the very least, this event would have made businesses realize that treating their workers better and giving them better wages would naturally make their businesses more profitable. This is what would make the changes in workers' rights happen and replace the progressive era, providing the reforms that we see today. So, in conclusion, yes, the reforms still would have happened.